All right. Well, we are back here on the One Leg Up Network. I'm Alex Garrett, and you might have heard my episode recapping the entire event that we did in Washington, D.C. With the DDNC. Well, now I have Dane from the DDNC on my show. How are you, Dane?
I'm doing well. It's DC is a little chilly, but it's always nice when you have advocates visiting to kind of warm things up and bring some good cheer to the Capitol Hill.
Dane Christiansen, if I'm not mistaken, you are the Washington representative for DDNC, and you have your pulse, your finger on the pulse of everything going on with these issues. First of all, maybe for those who don't know, why'd you get so interested in this cause?
Yeah, of course. So I've been doing this work since 2004. I've been on Capitol Hill for about 20 years now. My congressman was a guy named John Porter from the north side of Chicago. And John Porter led a committee that funds medical research, the NIH, the CDC, public health programs. And now I believe even has a building named after him on the NIH campus. But it was a very exciting time. We had just mapped the human genome. We were going to cure many different illnesses. Biotech was a new frontier in medicine. We had moved on to kind of new innovations and life-saving and life-supporting care. And of course, in just an example of how this all works incrementally, of course, when we talk about mapping the human genome now, 20 years later, the first products are coming to market. So it's a very long pipeline, and one that you have to stay dedicated to, but also one that I've been interested in my entire life.
And in this pipeline, I'm guessing is the research, all the funding and all that, and really the knowledge and research that goes into all this. I want to bring on specifically this week because, yes, there's a stopgap measure in place. I always thought Congress was literally just kicking the can down the road when it comes to some of these things. But being at your forum opened my eyes that no, every stopgap, even if it doesn't move forward everything, it is important because it keeps the funding currently in place. Am I right?
Yes. So what they're on right. So the federal government's fiscal year starts October 1st. I apologize if any of this is too Civics 101, but Congress has the power of the purse. Only the U.S. Congress can take money out of the Treasury. It can use taxpayer resources. They fund medical research. They fund the FBI. They fund the Department of Agriculture. They write something called appropriations bills. Congress, for many years, does not finish their work by October 1st when the fiscal year starts. They usually finish their work by December 20th when they're trying to get out of town at the end of the session. This last year, though, they didn't finish their work. They passed on October 1st something called a continuing resolution, keeps the government funded at the previous year's level, so everything stays the same. And then on December 20th, they passed another one till March 14th. The new Congress had to figure out how to deal with this. The new Congress is now hurtling towards Friday and figuring out what bill they're going to pass. They can increase medical research, they can decrease it, they can do any number of things. They listen to their constituents. But what they're trying to do right now, the easiest thing, since they don't have a lot of time, is probably just keep everything the same. But in order for them to do that, the bill has to pass the House, has to pass the Senate, has to be signed by the president. So they need everybody to kind of reach agreement in a very short order.
In that very big way, not only were we fighting for the future, right? So we were sort of fighting for these bills to be reintroduced or introduced on
Mhm.
that floor, but you're also fighting to keep the current. It is a fight every day, isn't it, Dane?
Yes. Yeah, and they add things to those bills. So right now, of course, it's how much for medical research, how much for public health, and the easiest thing might be say, well, geez, why don't we just leave these at the FY24 levels? Never a great situation. You have inflation, of course, so you lose a little bit of purchasing power if you don't have an increase. And that would be true for everybody. All programs would stay the same, but they also add in policy things that are timely. They might add in the fix to Medicare physician reimbursement. They might add in extensions to telehealth so people can keep seeing their doctor. These
And
are all
that's
things
so
that,
huge
yeah,
because people may not be able to get out of their house. So the
yes.
telehealth measures are so important.
But the important thing is you don't need to tell your members of Congress do this, that, or the other thing. If they know telehealth is important to you, they will look for ways to pass it, which means they might do an extension in this package that's coming up. You don't have to be the expert that says, I need you to do an amendment or any of this stuff. You just need to say, this is important to me. It's really on them to figure out how to get it done on your behalf.
Talk about the work that we all did last week going to these different offices. Firstly, to have these relationships with with the Senate and the staffers of the House and the staffers. As someone who's a representative, must mean a lot to you because look at the work that's being able to be done through these relationships. But I did notice they focus more on the Democrats. Is that why? Is it because no matter what they say, to always be an ear in the Democrats' ear is important as much as the Republicans?
Absolutely. Well, I think there's a couple things. One is, if I called them up and said, "Hey, I would love to come by and talk to you about this," they would say, "That's great, but we're too busy. Can you just send me an email?" They want to see you when you're in town. It means an awful lot that you flew to DC, that you took the time to speak with them, that you're their constituent. If they say if you're traveling here to talk about this, it must really matter to you. They know that it's not easy, for many folks to get here to spend a day walking around. So, and this is what they're here for. It's a resource that not everyone takes advantage of, but the offices are here to accept your input. The reason it might seem to skew a little Democratic is, lots of folks live in like large urban and suburban areas.
Sure.
You might be close to an airport or the train station, and that might have more likely to have a Democratic member. We do have plenty of folks that we're visiting with Republicans as well. So it's bipartisan, bicameral, but the important thing is the fact that you're their constituent is why, they want to see you. And that represents both the House and Senate and Democrats and Republicans.
Now you mentioned something very interesting in our forum on the Sunday, which is you could hold up the sign, even though you're not going to do that when you're meeting with them. We can stand outside and hold up signs, but we're not like that. So
Yes.
how does the DDNC sort of recruit those that may want to protest? But I think this is a better way to protest, or at least bring awareness, right? Rather than holding the sign, you're actually
Oh,
in
yeah.
their offices. That's a better way to do it.
Yeah, I mean, there's a difference between activism and advocacy. Activism might be great at raising awareness, which is important too, but advocacy is a little different. So if you even, there's a process that happens. The process is member driven, and the members are driven by their constituents. So if you want more money for medical research, or you want to prevent cuts to Medicaid, for example,
Mhm.
talking to them now at certain points of the process matters. If you show up in October and say, "I wanted to talk to you about this," they would say, "Geez, well, I wish you would have, you would have stopped by in March." So there's timing to some of this, and we help with that. It's connecting them with simple things like when they're working on these spending bills. But yes, the important thing to remember is the squeaky wheel does get the grease. If people come in and say, "I need you to support medical research," any office, Democrat or Republican, senator or representative, is going to say, "Okay, this is going to be one of my top priorities because my constituents are telling me medical research matters and they care about this." And I know some conditions are quite rare. We would tell people if you're a rare community, it's all the more important that they know who you are and who you represent because they can be your champion, but they probably wouldn't have that information if you weren't bringing it to them. So.
All right, talk to me about the bills that we were advocating for down in DC. I sort of covered that on my show, but I feel like I can only give it from the rah rah. Let's get these on the House floor perspective. You really know these bills inside and out. So talk about the four different bills I've been talking about with the Safe Step Act, Help Co-Pays Act, the Food Nutrition Therapy Act, if I'm not mistaken, and the relabelization is very interesting also. But the bills on DDNC's mind that you've been going through. Talk
Yeah.
about each one of them for a few minutes if you can.
So the DDNC identifies bills a couple of different ways. Of course, we're a grassroots organization. We have many different organizations involved. So we rely on people to tell us things are happening. For example, with the Medical Nutrition Equity Act and the Medical Nutrition Therapy Act, that was a grassroots phenomenon. People were coming to the DDNC and saying, "My doctor is telling me I need this product or I need, some type of assistance with tube feeding." And lo and behold, I'm being told to pay out of pocket or I'm dealing with other issues. This seems wrong. And this is physician-directed medical care. It may not be a prescription, but it's very similar. And that's how we started working on those issues. And of course, that's the same way Congress ended up introducing bills like the Medical Nutrition Therapy Act or the Medical Nutrition Equity Act. We look for legislation, though, that preserves the patient and doctor relationship. Are you and your doctor able to decide what care is best for you and what you should be doing without interference or steering or anything else? And do you have access to all products and all sites of care? People aren't restricting your choices or saying, "I think you should try this or something else." You and the doctor can decide what your care plan should be. They're the only one who's an expert. And then it's bills that tend to be bipartisan. Of course, the issues that are polarizing make a lot of news, but the
Sure.
only things that get done are things where everybody agrees it's a good idea. And they do, work on this regularly, even though they seem polarized right now. They passed a couple of bills in what they call suspension or unanimous consent, where everyone just says aye and they vote on it because everyone agrees it's a good idea. The one of the bills we work on is the Safe Step Act, which has to do with step therapy. And it says, if you are, your doctor says you need a certain product, and an insurance company says, well, we're going to switch this to a different product, and we think you should fail on that first before going on to something else. You have a right to know that that's happened. And your doctor also has potentially the ability to override that and say, no, I'm the medical expert. This could be dangerous. We're using what I said. This isn't a ban on the practice. It's just guardrails. It's a compromise. But that bill had 250 co-sponsors in the last Congress. But
Wow.
the House only has 435 members. So, that's majority support. When it gets reintroduced, it should be close to passing. It has enough votes to pass. Another bill that's very close to passing is the Help Copays Act. This has to do with copayment assistance. And basically it says, if someone helps you with a copay card or helps you, with your pharmacy payments, it has to be counted to your out-of-pocket maximum. An insurer can't take that assistance and then tell you, okay, now you also have to keep giving me money until I reach the out-of-pocket. It's double dipping. That bill had 150 co-sponsors last time, so it's newer, but it's reaching that tipping point of support. It's clearly a patient care issue. And that bill was just reintroduced in the Senate recently, just a couple of days ago. So right after we were on the Hill, that bill got reintroduced in the Senate. We're waiting to see it be reintroduced in the House. And another bill that I think is important is one called the Treat and Reduce Obesity Act, which has to do with coverage for products and services related to what they call anti-obesity medications or GLP-1s. You can have metabolic disorders. You can have a variety of issues where this might matter. But this is a good example, like with medical nutrition therapy, where science moves forward quickly sometimes, but the regulatory framework that Congress works on sometimes moves in geologic time. So if a Congress hasn't passed a law and says this is how coverage will work for these products, or this is how reimbursement's going to work for these services, they might not be covered at all. So they need to update that. And now we've reached new frontiers in medicine. So making sure people have proper access and coverage through federal programs like Medicare and Medicaid that then helps with private insurance matters a great deal. So that's a newer issue, but one that's picking up steam too.
I mean, you talk about all these different things. And firstly, those that advocated for all these, is the tent pretty big? Like, can people who are able-bodied yet have friends or family, obviously caregivers, but beyond that, anybody seems to be encouraged to register, which I find very helpful, right?
Yes.
For these forums.
Yeah,
So
you don't always have to be a patient. We say tell your story, but the fact that you chose to be there matters. You could be a parent, you can be a caregiver. I did a Hill Day once for a rare disease where somebody showed up that was simply the neighbor of a person who had the condition. And they said, I know my neighbor, they're a good friend, they're too sick to travel, but I wanted to come and speak on their behalf. The same thing with the offices. The fact that you did that means a lot to them. They know that you have a pure self-interest. They know that you can really tell folks how the healthcare system is working. And the fact that you care matters a great deal. So you don't always have to have a patient story. Sometimes it's a provider story. Sometimes it's a caregiver story. And sometimes it's just a friend of the community. But all those voices matter.
Dane, I gotta ask you this. You just mentioned geologic time frames of Congress and
Yep.
whatnot. I find that some of these bills, are they even breathing? You know what I mean? Or they sort of need to be resurrected right now?
Yeah, so anytime, of course, that you have a Congress that ends, like the 118th Congress, Congress is always in session for 2 years, ended last December, bills always have to be reintroduced. They start the process over, they get a new bill number, but they don't ever go back to zero. If you have a bill with 250 co-sponsors, most of those folks are still in Congress. It's going to start ahead of the curve. It builds year over year, and it reaches a tipping point. And the best example I can give is there was a bill years ago called the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act, which makes sense to us, but said if you get tested and you find out that you have a condition like you have proclivity for breast cancer, for example, your employer can't fire you from your job, and an insurance plan couldn't say we're not giving you a policy like life insurance because you're more likely to get sick. They wouldn't want to disincentivize you knowing your status and being able to protect yourself. It took about 10 years to pass that bill. But when it passed, I think, the House like 420 to 1. Everybody voted for it. Its time had come. It carried over, the goal line excessively. We're getting close with things like the Safe Step Act and Help Copays Act. Other bills like medical nutrition therapy and treat and reduce obesity will probably be there in time as well as that support grows. But the only reason a member becomes a co-sponsor or supporter is because their constituents reached out and said, this is why you should do this and why it matters. They do these judgments based on who they talk to locally.
I was going to say, I feel like we have to continue the conversation, not just go down to Washington, but then let's do a recap. Let's do an after, because then someone hearing this could literally call their congressman or woman and say, hey, I heard this show. Can you get this bill, back up and running again type of thing. For you, Dane, though, you've been doing this for how many years, by the way?
20 years now, 2004 or so, just over.
Have you noticed that that walk to the Capitol must give you goosebumps every year, right? I mean, it must be something special to do that walk.
It's always different, challenges and opportunities, and but the process remains the same. And the important thing is that, the things we talk about are nonpartisan and non-controversial. The opposition isn't another group. Nobody's coming to the Hill and saying, don't fund medical research or don't do this for the most part. It's just members that are busy and probably aren't familiar with these issues. They need to be educated. They need to know how it affects people back home. The enemy, for lack of a better phrase, is a lack of awareness. So people being here and spreading the word matters a great deal. But yes, always, it's always interesting. It's always a new challenge. But the heartening thing is that the process always stays the same, which is that members of Congress make these decisions based on relationships they have with their constituents. And that's ultimately what moves things forward. And you do see progress. You look at a number of cancers where the 5-year survivability rate improves. You look at a number of conditions where, maybe it went from being having a high mortality rate to being a manageable chronic disease. It's one foot in front of the other. And over time, it really makes a difference. And when you go to something like a patient conference or an annual meeting, you see a gap between, generationally in terms of how care is improved. And it's encouraging to know that it gets better and better every year, but it's a result of community input and everybody working together.
Speaking of that, the wide age range that seemed to be there this year must be there every year. How awesome is that for you to see? Wow, every generation is at this meeting. This is how important it is.
Absolutely. And of course, it's folks from all over the country. We have probably 30 states represented, West Coast, East Coast, North, South. And then it's different walks of life, different perspectives, but everyone's there for the same reason. Everybody wants to make a difference, and that's what matters. And it continues to matter on Capitol Hill.
All right. So we had this round of bills, right, that we were promoting and advocating for. Do the bills change as the forums go year after year? Like, are there different bills you're looking into to say, hey, let's get this back on the docket?
Yes, and usually it's because something gets done and we moved on to something else. And I'll just give an example. There have been issues with prior authorization. That's, bills are very popular. I think had 350 co-sponsors, so that's almost going to pass. Folks might remember we had something called the 4 Pillars of Patient Protection years ago, which said children should be able to stay on family coverage till they're 26. Insurance company can't deny you a policy because you have a pre-existing condition. These are things we all know and understand now, but 15 years ago, they weren't the case. So you get things done and you move on to the next things. Once, we deal with stuff like Safe Step and Help Copays, there will be new challenges. There's an emerging challenge right now, this newer, just a couple years old, called alternative funding programs, where if somebody, has a policy, they maybe have their specialty drug coverage excluded, and then someone tries to find them an alternative outside of like insurance to get access to that product. Maybe a short donations, a short-term solution, but this isn't the way it's meant to work. So the situation evolves as progress is made. And then, of course, the community needs to move forward as well. But it's important to remember that, recently we ended surprise medical billing. We have the 4 pillars now. So there are issues that we were working on that are done and now settled law, and we move on to the next thing. But it's always, that march one foot in front of the other.
We had a very, very, I would say, docile group that didn't really scream in the faces. But have you had those experiences where like advocates go there and start yelling at the staffer's face? I find that disrespectful, but have you ran into that ever?
Not usually. And the reason is I think sometimes people, when they first get to DC, they confuse the offices, which are policy staff, with the campaigns.
Hmm.
And the people that are campaigning are, it's a different thing when they're on TV and they're trying to get elected. You know, you can say whatever you want. We have free speech in this country. When you are elected and you're in a policy office, you're there to make good law for your constituents. So they roll out the red carpet, they're very accommodating. Political issues rarely come up. And then even if you have a preconceived notion about somebody's politics, after you meet with them, folks usually leave and say, that was really nice. And that staffer was really nice. And they usually
It does
become
give you
quite
some
helpful.
kind of hope that, government is working for us. Doesn't it give you that hope every year?
Oh, absolutely. And it helps a lot if you do actually contact those offices, you make connections with them, you talk about the things that matter to you, you make it clear you have an expectation that they're going to work on your behalf. You find that they're often trying to be very accommodating.
The follow up seems to be very important because you don't want them to lose sight of those bills that we've been talking about the last couple of weeks, for sure.
Yeah.
Now, Dane, I have to say this because I look at it also from the newsworthy perspective, and it's true. These type of things are up against big pharma. So how do you combat that kind of that seems to be a challenge as well.
Yeah, big pharma, big insurance. The fact of the matter, though, is even though you have large entities, the members are ultimately, and they can go in and talk about whatever they want to. The members themselves are listening to their patient constituents because someone can say, "Oh, the healthcare system's working great," or "Oh, things have never been better." But the only way they can make that assessment is it working well for you? What was your time to diagnosis? Did you have enough treatments available after you were diagnosed? Were you told you had to go somewhere far away for specialized care? Did you need something and then you found out you had to pay out of pocket for it? When you give them these personal stories, it helps them plug those gaps. They can identify the challenges and opportunities, and they can make sure that they're passing laws or new policies that work for you because everyone's going to say they're doing the right thing and that the system is working, but they can't make that judgment call unless they know how it's working for you in their district that has a specific issue and needs a specific set of services.
Any patient story that actually made you tear up over the last 20 years you've been doing this?
Absolutely. And this, I won't say names, but it has to do with a personal friend that passed away. They were a very bold cancer advocate and end up being diagnosed with pretty aggressive cancer themselves. We tried to do everything we could. I think when you have a diagnosis like that, you have to work particularly quick. And there was a lot of progress made in a short amount of time. It didn't save that person's life, but it did help save other lives moving forward. And that's, heartening in and of itself too.
It's funny as an advocate, I often think of others, right? Because I want to go there to help others live as long as I've been able to live. But, I guess we all go in there saying, well, if it can benefit us also, that's a win-win. But I love that we all go down there to help others, not just ourselves in that regard.
Absolutely.
Dane, I was going to ask you if you had a personal story to this, because obviously you're in this for a reason. You're in this fight
Yeah.
every year for a reason. And that might be one of them. But what was alongside your Congressman Porter? What else drove you? Did you have family? Did you have friends that were in this, not even digestive disease, but disabled or something like
Yeah,
that?
I think you bring up a good point, which is I didn't end up working in biotech. So that wasn't the draw for me. The draw was improving people's lives and being able to help folks. Kind of that service oriented goal. That's always aligned with where I've been personally. And that's why I didn't take, other jobs on the Hill or things like that, because this is what I've been wanting to do. What's interesting to me, I won't get into specifics, but I do have family members that have been affected by all of these things. There's a bill right now called Supplemental Oxygen Access Reform Act that has to do with, DME and medical equipment and people who have conditions that are lung related not being able to get the oxygen they need.
Sure.
It's affected members of my family. The Help Copays Act, the Safe Step Act, chronic diseases in this country are quite common. Everybody has a family member who's affected by
I
something.
think I read where 70% of Americans or even more have at least two, which I find mind-boggling. But there we are.
And that's when you see their stories from Thanksgiving or just getting together, and then you see the legislation coming through too that's meant to tackle the exact issue. But
I got a chance to be in the House gallery when they introduced the resolution to honor those killed in the plane crash
yep.
above the Potomac. And I'm just saying to myself, we can be there too. Our resolutions can get on the floor as well, not just the newsy things, but really on the ground, grassroots. And this is the other thing I want to ask, because someone said, well, you were just lobbying. It didn't feel like lobbying, though. You know what I mean? It felt like a real, genuine conversation. So if you want to do that instead of lobby, I suggest joining DDNC because you guys do it right.
Absolutely. And it's not lobbying, quote unquote. Every American, this is a constitutionally protected right. Your right to go to your members of Congress and tell them what they need to do for you is constitutionally protected. Not everyone knows that, and not everyone takes advantage of it. Lobbying is thought of as some kind of, fee for service, or you're there for something, but anybody can make their voice heard for a cause that they care about. And that's more powerful than anything else. The fact that you've chosen to do this, that you volunteered to do it, that is so much more compelling to the members. And those personal stories, that's why they just matter that much more. But I wouldn't call it lobbying. It's definitely advocacy, but it's an advocacy as we do it and as the DDNC patients and their family do it is a constitutionally protected right and one that everybody should take advantage of.
And the best route to do it. I mean, we're just literally having an open, frank conversation. That's what it comes down to. Dane, I did like that the registration was free. How does DDNC able to do that with all the costs that probably go into these events? How do you make registration free for people?
There's a combination of things. One is, of course, all of the member organizations chip in so that the DDNC can be a thriving organization.
52, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, a lot, dozens. Yeah, and this is every colorectal cancer, Crohn's disease, liver disease. There was a time years ago when everybody came together and said we need a coalition for digestive diseases, and the impetus for that back in the late 70s, early 80s was that there was almost no research being done. They started something called the National Commission on Digestive Diseases together. That research became hundreds of millions of dollars in research year over year, led to treatments, led to FDA issues, which then led to coverage and access and out-of-pocket cost issues. And everyone has kept working together since then, but everybody chips in a little bit to make sure it can happen. And then a lot of folks, the registration is always open. Anybody can volunteer to be there. Anyone can say, I'm going to make the commitment to go to DC. This matters to me. And many folks do. So if you want to get added to the listserv, if you want to get involved with a group that participates, like the Celiac Disease
The
Foundation,
Ostomy Association,
yeah,
that was
United
mine.
Ostomy Association, you can do that too. So, but please get involved and participate.
Dan, I gotta say, as someone with disabilities who's able to move around and rollerblade and all that fun stuff, I learned a lot about what others were going through too. Like, I didn't know there were 1 million people with ostomies. Do you find that people come back to you and say, wow, I might have these things, but I didn't realize how widespread it is? It makes you feel less alone, that's for sure.
Absolutely. There is a sense of kinship, and that comes from working through the national patient organizations too. And then usually, there's a lot of myths and misperceptions out there. I think people deal with it every day. If you talk to people at the grocery store or others you meet in different environments, think of congressional staff the same way. They might have those same myths and misperceptions. They're just regular folks too. They're not necessarily policy wonks or experts. And you giving them that info, this is what's going on with my condition, that basic data, this is how many Americans are affected. It might be very illuminating to them, but if you don't deliver that information, who's going to do it?
Absolutely. And Dane, how about the fall? Because I know you guys do this twice a year. What's the fall? Because obviously you did this right before budget talks and all that. What's the fall forum like?
Yeah, the fall forum is more of a chance to hear a couple of things. We do this event near Capitol Hill again. The fall forum will include members of Congress working on these issues, and then a number of policy staff that are experts as well. And they'll give everybody updates. So you started advocating in March, on the budget, on spending, or on some of these policy items. This is where we're at now, and this is where we're going next. And that's a timely update after the August recess for what's going to happen moving into the end of the year. So it's a nice way to bookend and update and know where we can be effective advocates as December rolls around and they might be finishing the spending bills or anything else.
As a DC rep, I feel like your job never ends, right? It's always ongoing and always looking for that new bill to look for. And of course, keep an eye on what's going on in the bills already up for debate and whatnot.
Absolutely. And appropriations, these are must-pass bills. I think people know What they're talking about right now is if they can't find an agreement on the 14th, we're going to have a government shutdown. The government stops working. So they have to do this, but they have to do it every year. So there's always a need. They always rewrite these bills. And one example, the Department of Defense has something called the peer-reviewed medical research program. That conditions on that list are deemed eligible for study. The only way for conditions to end up on that list is people ask their senators to include them. And when their senators write the bill, they put them in there. There's usually a military service connection, but they know that people are affected. So it's a really good example of democracy in action. But your senator might have lost re-election or retired. So
Sure.
now a new person's going to write that bill. You need to be engaged and participating year in and year out. We have to do it, but we encourage advocates to make that commitment as well.
100%. Dane, I got to ask you a couple more things if you don't mind. Firstly, you mentioned the turnover. Any big senators in the last 20 years that really have said, you know what, I'm going to meet with these folks, not just with the staffers, but I'm going to be
Yeah.
there.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a couple, people will remember some. I'll just use some names that folks might be familiar with. Joe Lieberman,
Yeah.
he met with the DDNC and got an award and spent a lot of time with everybody. So Buddy Carter from Georgia, who leads the Help Copays Act, came to the Fall Forum last year and spent a long time talking with everyone, as did Jim McGovern, who is the leader on a lot of these medical nutrition and food issues. So they do make when it depends on when we're there and when their schedules line up, but they love to have a chance to chat with you and give you updates when they can. But
And then for those who may not feel like they have a voice or no one's going to listen to me and, you know, woe is me, I have this disability, but no one's going to listen to me. What's your message to those folks? Not just going to the forum, but do you feel like more should get involved in their different diseases? I mean, it seems like there's more advocacy out there than people realize.
yeah, I would say choose your own level of involvement. If you're more comfortable, sending an email or responding to what's called an action alert, start there. You don't have to be making virtual visits or traveling to Washington, D.C., but your voice really matters. And the one thing I'll say is there's always a risk to not being involved too. We say the squeaky wheel gets the grease, but we also say you can be at the table or you can be on the menu, which is there's a downside to having no advocacy for a community as well, which is usually a relatively stagnant research apparatus, limited treatment development, and no real attention to specific coverage and access issues affecting the community. If you're not doing it, who's going to?
Well, do you find the rural community really comes to these things and advocates? Because obviously the rural communities have a little less of an advantage than the urban areas, right?
Yeah, but recently that's become more pronounced. And there's a lot of patient organizations that have been trying to do things like instead of having an annual meeting in Philadelphia, have one in Indianapolis where you're reaching new environments and new folks. But we've seen, there's been a lot of talk about rural care and some of the unique challenges of not being close to a large academic health center. And the reason why Congress is now interested in this is because they're hearing from more and more constituents that are saying these are their problems. They don't want to have to travel an hour or 2 hours to see somebody who they need to see regularly.
100%. Well, Dane, this has been really eye-opening, and I know you mentioned the congressional website where people can get, but is there a way we can get an alert on all these bills that we've been talking about? Like, oh, let me get an email about how this bill is progressing.
Yeah, there's a couple websites. One is congress.org, where you can look up bills. Another one's called govtrack.us, and some of these are pro bono services. Congress is a service of the Library of Congress, which actually, is the government repository. And then many of in these organizations. So if the Crohn's and Colitis Foundation is active on the Help Copays bill, they might send out dedicated updates and even information saying now is the time, to take action. The DDNC will do this as well. We have a listserv. We can add people's names to it if they want updates, but we also encourage you to work with any patient organization that might closely align with your interests.
You know, I've been looking for the DDNC's social media. Are you guys on social media at all? I don't see you guys.
We're going to be more on social media moving forward. This has been a commitment of some folks, including the United Ostomy Associations of America leadership, that we start to enter a little bit more of the 21st century. So we always look for support and assistance there, but we're planning to have a little bit more of a social media presence moving forward to reach a broader community and a younger community.
35 forums, that's pretty longevity. How have you guys been able to keep it going for 35 years? And how did DDNC get started, if you don't mind?
Yeah, so DDNC was originally a few different organizations coming together. They rallied around this idea of doing research and forming this National Commission on Digestive Diseases. From that core group, though, it grew, from I think it was three initially, as you mentioned, now it's 50. So, and the nice thing is, of course, after 35 years, you have a lot of folks who've retired and passed the torch. So there's been this need. Everyone has bought into the cause, though, and the importance of why we're here and what we're doing. And it's made it easy to go from generation to generation and from meeting to meeting with limited disruption because everyone understands why we need to do more for the digestive disease community. What we're doing might change year to year, but the fact that the need is there will always remains. And hopefully one day you reach cures, you reach improvements, and it might not be necessary, but that day is not today, unfortunately.
Well, in your research, I don't know if you've ever come across the name Dr. Henry Viscardi, but he was basically a champion of the ADA. He helped make many trips to Washington. So I felt that spirit because I graduated from his high school and I got to know him as a kid. So I felt like I was channeling Dr. V's advocacy. And so thank you for allowing me to continue his legacy through your guys' work as well.
Thank you. And thank you for attending this year.
And we'll be back down there for sure. I've got a feeling this isn't a one-time thing, so I'd love to come back.
Excellent.
All right. That was Dane Christiansen of the DDNC Washington Bureau, if you will. Thanks for joining me, Dane, on the One Leg Up Network.
Thank you.